So you've just bought a new bike and you want to know how you can take care of it. One of the awesome things about bicycles is they can last such a long time if you take care of them. I'm going to run you through a few things today that can help you prolong the life of your bike. So when talking about different parts of the bike, the first thing we can talk about is the consumable parts. The reason I call them consumable parts is that we will slowly wear through them. So we do expect that they will get worn out and will need to be replaced. But there's some things that we can do to make sure that they last as long as they can. Let's list off a couple of them. Chain would be one thing, tires, brake pads, maybe handlebar tape or the grips that you have on the handlebars. Going a little bit more in depth from the chain, we can talk about the cassette and the chain rings or even the jockey wheels or in general all the different moving parts. We could talk about the bearings as well in the headset or in the wheels or in the bottom bracket. They're all consumable parts, but there's a few things we can do to make sure that they last as long as they possibly can. So one of the most important things that can wear out on your bike is the chain. The chain will wear out when it stretches over time. If it's stretching, it's not sitting into each of the grooves of the cassette or the chain rings and it might be slipping over the top, as quite an extreme example. If you're unsure if your chain is worn out, it might be worth popping into your local bike shop, preferably here, and we've got this trusty little tool here that can measure how much the chain has stretched as well. So it will measure the distance over 4 lengths and it will be able to tell us the condition of the chain and will be able to tell us yes or no, do you need a new chain? Lube for the chain can seem more complicated than it needs to be. The long and short of it is that we've got 2 different links that are rubbing up against each other and we just want to put a little bit of lubricant between them to limit how much they're wearing each other out. You can over lubricate the chain, so I'm just going to say listen to the recommendations on the back of the bottle or the website of that particular brand of lubricant. It's not as difficult as it might seem. When I'm putting chain lube on, we've got the top section and the bottom section. I choose to put it on the bottom section because I think that's the part that's rubbing up against all the different metal parts as it goes around the drivetrain there. So I just hold my fist up against the rear derailleur and I hold the bottle upside down while doing 1 full revolution of the chain, just like this. That's all it needs. You don't need to put on any more than that. 1 full revolution is all the lubricant that you'll need. Another important thing to talk about is the tires. Talking about how the tires have worn out over time, one way that we can tell on a racing bike like this one is if we run our finger over the top, if we can feel that it's flat on the top, it means that it's obviously worn out and become a little bit thinner. This is something that we expect to happen with riding. As we're riding along the bitumen roads or wherever you're riding, gravel, anything like that, it's obviously going to wear the tire out because there's a lot of friction up against the road. So we want to make sure that it's not becoming too thin and too, I'm going to say, likely for a thorn to be able to push through it. Another one to think about is if you have a gravel bike, you should be able to look with your eyes and if you can see that the knobs that were there when you bought it, if they're starting to get polished off, that's a pretty clear indicator that the tread is becoming a bit thinner and again, more likely to get a puncture. Hopefully you've just bought a brand new bike, so this shouldn't be a problem, but it's still worth talking about. If you've left your bike sitting in the shed for a long time and it's sitting in the warm, dry back area of your shed over months or years, the actual rubber of the tire can begin to get quite dry and crack. So if you're pulling your bike out of the shed for the first time in a while, it might be worth bringing it into the bike shop so that we can run our eyes over it and give it a nice little service as well. And we can have a really good look at the tires and make sure they're not cracking as well. Tire wear is an unfortunate part of cycling. However, this is a good opportunity to be able to try different tires as well. Perhaps you want to go to a wider tire and be a little bit more comfortable, or a more grippy tire, or a brand that your friend recommended, anything like that. Be prepared to replace your tires. It is part of cycling and it's so important because it's your only contact point with the road. Tires are one of the most important things on your bicycle, I reckon. While we're on that topic of them being consumable, they are obviously rubber. So if you can take it to a rubber recycling depot, I would appreciate it. Or bring it in here and we can add it to our large pile of rubber recycling as well. But if you can avoid just chucking it in the bin, I would appreciate it. If your brake lever feels spongy, this particular example feels quite good, but if the lever was pulling in really close to the handlebar, it's usually one of 3 things. We can look at the fact that the hydraulic fluid through the brake on this particular example might be old, or maybe it's missing, or there's some air bubbles in there. It could also be that the brake pads are beginning to wear out or the brake rotors are beginning to wear out. both of those things, the pads and rotors, when I say wear out, I mean they're becoming a bit thinner because again, they're a consumable part. Some of the ways that you can tell if your brake pads or rotors are worn out, one of them is by the sound, and one of them is, like I said before, about the feel as well. Talking about the sound, hopefully you've been riding your bike for long enough to know what typical sounds your bike will make. If it starts to sound a little bit different under braking, that can be one clear example that it might need new pads or rotors. Different sounds might sound like metallic scraping noise, whereas instead of having the pad brushing up against the rotor, now that the pad is worn out, you've got metal rubbing up against metal, and it can make quite an ugly noise. So that can be a pretty clear sign that we need to get new brake pads. Obviously here we're talking about a disc brake rotor. If we're talking about a rim brake bike, the brake pads will obviously be pushing onto the rim rather than onto the rotor. So again, a similar idea though, is that it can often make a different sound. Another thing that we can look at is simply with our eyes by looking inside the caliper at the rotors or at the caliper on the rim brake, and we can just see if the pads are starting to get thinner. On a rim brake, there's a wear line, which looks like this. And with a disc brake, we can look down the inside of the brake caliper at where the pads are and make sure that we can still see that there are pads in there and that it's not just completely worn out. If the pads are worn out, they're not there. This is what a brand new brake pad looks like. If it's significantly skinnier than this, it's time for new brake pads. Handlebar tape is another consumable part. When thinking about handlebar tape, I categorize it as a contact point with the bike. You've got your 2 feet, your bum, and your 2 hands. So I find handlebar tape to be very important, and it's something that we look at the entire time that we're riding. Our hands are sitting on the handlebar tape. This is some brand new handlebar tape that's been fitted, but one thing that we can see is that it might begin to rip, or it might begin to stretch, or it might begin to undo itself like a throttle almost of a motorbike. As it wears out, it could even turn your hands a little bit black or whatever color the handlebar tape that you have is. Although it's not performance, it's something that looks good and it's something that you're touching the entire time that you're riding. I love having new and clean handlebar tape all the time. While we're on the point of handlebar tape, we can come a little bit further along here and look at the hoods as well of a road bike here. Hoods, again, are a consumable part, usually between maybe $30 and $50, and they'll come as a pair. They're obviously rubber. As rubber gets really warm, you spend hours and hours in the sun, or you leave the bike sitting in the warm shed or something like that, they can begin to stretch. As well as that, they can also sort of turn your hands black as well and become quite sticky. Nobody likes sticky hoods, so they are another consumable part that you can expect to replace throughout the life of the bike. Something that we haven't spoken about too much in this video are bearings. Bearings are something that we can look at when you get your bike serviced, but to give you a very quick summary as to the consumable bearings, we've got the bottom bracket. There's usually 1 bearing on each side, so we've got 2. We can talk about the wheel bearings, both front and rear. There's 2 in the hub and 2 in the free hub. These parts are spinning the whole time that you're riding, so they will slowly wear out. They are a part that will need to be replaced eventually, but they're a little bit more difficult to know if they need replacing just at home. So it might be worth maybe mentioning when you get your bike serviced, hey bike shop, can you just check if any of my bearings need replacing? So now you're ready to go on your bike ride. There's a couple of things we just want to make sure are perfect before we go. Things like making sure that the tires are pumped up to the correct pressure, making sure that the pedals are nice and tight so they're not going to undo themselves while you're riding, making sure that you've lubricated your chain if it needs it. It doesn't need to be over lubed though, just make sure that it's lubed to the right amount, and also a bolt check over. But one of the most important parts I would say is making sure that the headset is nice and tight. There's nothing more dangerous than a loose headset. We'll talk about that in another video though. All right, so now you've come home from your bike ride. Now we want to talk about storing the bike, making sure that it's nice and safe and it's ready to go for next time. One thing I would say is to make sure that the bike is clean. There's nothing worse than leaving mud and leaving water all over the bike, and then it can slowly get rusty or worn out just by sitting still. So making sure the bike is clean and dry. I like to make sure that the bike is out of the way as well. If you're parking your bike in your garage, make sure you can still get to your car, or the family can still walk through the garage without bumping it over, because they might not tell you if they've bumped it over. Also, make sure that it's nice and safe. Make sure no thieves can see it from the street or anything like that as well. So maybe hiding it in the back of the shed, maybe even chaining it up if it's an expensive bike as well. If it's a mountain bike and it has tubeless wheels, it might be worth being a little bit pedantic and having the valves sitting at the top rather than sitting at the bottom. And if you've got a dropper seat post, I choose to leave it up. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. If you're unsure if any of your parts are worn out, feel free to bring it into our bike shop and we'd be more than happy to give it a service and even give you some advice about parts that might be almost worn out as well. Otherwise, I think we'll leave it with that. Thanks for watching. See ya.